Hey everyone, and welcome back to Daily Tuition. In this course, we are going to learn React Routes. You're going to learn all the new concepts of React Routes, and after this course, you'll be able to make your own React project with React Routes. So let me just show you what you're going to learn in this course. You're going to learn all the new concepts of React Router, just like nested routes, no match routes, URL parameters, index routes, active links, search parameters, and at the end, we are going to make Auth Project to understand React Route in the real world examples. So we're going to make a simple project and use React Router inside it. This course is for beginners. So we're going to start really from the scratch and learn all the concept in details. So let's dive in and see what is React Router. React Router is a full-featured client and server-side routing library for React. React Router used to navigate between pages. React Router keeps your UI in sync with the URL. To work with React Router, you need to first install React Router DOM in the React application. So let me first open the documentation of React Router. To work with React Router, you have to open the reactrouter.com, and here is the quick start of the React Router library. To install the React Router, you have to say npm install React Router DOM. Now let me just install this router in my React project. So we're going to first create the React project. So I'm going to execute a command called npx create React app and then specify name to it. I'm going to specify name to this app, React Router app, or you can specify any name to this application. That's among you. So this command is going to create the React application inside this project directory. You can see. Now, once you have your React application, you can just enter into your project directory and then execute a command called npm start. This is going to start the development server. So I'm going to say here cd React Router app and then press enter. This is going to enter into the project directory. Just for that, let me install the Tailwind CSS inside this project. Tailwind CSS allows us to style the React application. So I'm going to search for Tailwind CSS and click on the tailwindcss.com. Click on get started and then click on this framework guide. Here I'm going to search for create React app and then you have to first create the React application. We already have that. So let's move to the next step, where we're going to install the Tailwind CSS. So we need to install all these three libraries in the project. So here I'm going to say npm install -d Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer. So I'm going to install all these three libraries in the React project. So once we have that libraries, you have to execute a command npx Tailwind CSS init -p. Let me clear the screen and execute this command. This command is going to create two files inside your project. You don't have to worry about these files. This is just for configuring Tailwind CSS in the React application. Just for that, inside your tailwind config.js, you have to add this statement. So just copy this statement and open the tailwind config.js and specify that right here inside this content. Something like this. Save this file, close the tailwind config.js, back to the documentation. Just for that, you have to copy all these three directives and paste that inside index.css. So back to your project, open the source, and here you're going to have the index.css file. Just clear all this CSS and paste your Tailwind directives. Just after that, you can start your React project. But before that, let me just grab this h1 heading tag, back to the app.js, get rid of all this right from here, and then specify this h1 heading tag here. Something like this. Now this h1 heading tag have the Tailwind CSS classes. Let me save this file, back to the index.css, save this, open the terminal, clear the screen, and I'm going to say here npm start to start the development server. So this is going to start the React application on the local host 3000. Just after that, I want to change the font family of the application. So I'm going to back to the index.css, and at the top, here I'm going to import the font family called Poppins from the Google Font website. And then just after this, and right down here, I'm going to say star, select all the elements, and then specify font family Poppins. And the callback font family is sans serif. Save this file. This is going to change the font family of this application. Now let me close this Tailwind CSS documentation and then back to my project. Here, I'm going to get rid of all the unnecessary files from this source folder. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to get rid of this app test.js right from here. Get rid of this logo SVG. Get rid of this setup test and this report web vital. Get rid of both these files from this project. We are not working on it. Let me just back to the index.js. You have to get rid of this web vital function right from here. Get rid of this import statement. And inside this app.js, you have this logo SVG. Get rid of it. We are not using it. Save this file. Save this index file as well. And now if you back to your React project, you will have the result something like this. Now this is the starter project. If you want to start right from here, you can just download this project from the link provided in the description. So you have to just enter into the master branch and download this project. Now just out that, we have to install this React Router DOM in this project. So I'm going to open the terminal, open a new terminal, enter into the project directory, React Router app, and here I'm going to say npm install, and then I'm going to specify the name of the library, which is React Router DOM. So I'm going to specify that here. At the time of recording this video, the current version of this React Router DOM is version 6. So I'm going to press enter and install this latest version inside this React application. Once we have this, if you open the package.json file, you can notice inside the dependencies, you will have here React Router DOM. Let me close this terminal, back to the index.js, and now let me show you how you can connect this React Router DOM to this React application. So very first, we need to connect the React Router DOM to the React application, so we can sync the UI with the URL. So at the top here, just out of this app, I'm going to import browser router from React Router DOM. We're going to use this component as a wrapper to this application because it stores the current location in the browser address bar using the clean URLs and navigates using the browser built-in history stack. So using this browser router, we're going to store all the information of the URL in the browser history. So I'm going to copy this, get rid of this React strict mode, and specify the browser router here. If you want, you can specify this browser router inside this strict mode as well. But I'm going to get rid of this React Router strict mode and then specify this browser router as a wrapper to this app component. Now let me save the changes. Back to the app.js. If you're back to the app, nothing changes. But now we are ready to start messing with the URLs. So let me first make the navigation. So I'm going to toggle this window on the right side and I'm going to put my application on the left side. Now inside this app component, let me get rid of this h1 heading tag and create the navigation menu. To make the navigation menu, let me get rid of this app right from here, and then I'm going to call the Tailwind CSS classes here. First is container and mx auto. So this class is used to center the content. Just for that, here I'm going to add nav element and then specify some classes here of Tailwind. So bg gray 100, and then inside this nav right here, I'm going to add an anchor tag. To this anchor tag, I'm going to specify href attribute, which is invoice, and then the text is going to be in the span tag. So I'm going to add here a span tag, and then here I'm going to say invoice. Duplicate this statement, and instead of invoice, here I'm going to say expenses. Let me do the same for this path. So in the href attribute, I'm going to say expense. Let me save the changes. So here we have the navigation menu. Let me add some space between these anchor tags. So what if I specify here flex? So if I specify here flex column, gap 4, this will add some space between these navigation items. Now let me show you what would happen when I click on these invoices. When I click on it, it will reload the browser and navigate us to this invoice URL. When I click on these expenses, it will reload the browser again and redirect us to this expenses URL. This is not the single page application does. So instead of using this anchor tag, I'm using the React Router DOM link component. So at the top, here I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to say link from React Router DOM. I'm going to replace this anchor tag with this link component, something like this. Let me save the changes. This is going to return an error message. So if you open your console, then you will have here an error message. This is because this href attribute is not the property of this link component. Instead of this href, we specify here 2. 2 is just like the href attribute. We are passing the address to the anchor tag using this 2 property. Let me save the changes, and now you can see we have these invoices and the expenses. Now when I back to the home page and click on this invoices, it will redirect you to the new invoices URL. And when I click on these expenses, you can see you're on the expenses URL, but without reloading the browser. You don't have any routes that render when the URL changes yet. Right now, you don't have any routes that render when the URL changes yet, but link is changing the URL without causing a full page reload. Now what I want to render the component as well with this URL. So for the invoices URL, I want to render the component invoices, and for the expenses URL, I want to render the component expenses. So let's create both these components right inside this source folder. I'm going to create a new folder here and name this folder component. And inside this, I'm going to create two files. For the first file, I'm going to specify name invoice.js. And for the second file, I'm going to specify name expenses.js. Inside this invoice.js right here, I'm going to simply say export default function. The function name is invoices. And then I'm going to simply return a division tag with some tailwind classes. So I'm simply going to say here text center. And inside this div, here I'm going to say h2, h1, and then specify here invoices. Let me copy this, save this file back to the expenses, and specify the same component here. But instead of invoices, right now I'm going to say here expenses. Let me just change the text as well, expenses. And now what I have to do is I have to link this URL with these components. To do that, we are using routes and route component. So let me just close both these component and back to the index.js. Right here inside this browser router, I'm going to add two more components. First is routes and second is route. Now using this React router DOM, we can import two more components, routes and route. Inside this browser router, we are going to use both these components. So let me get it out this app component. Here I'm going to call routes, and inside this we have route. In the React router DOM, routes and route are the primary ways to render something in the React application. Routes and route are the primary ways to render something in the React router based on the current location. You can think about these routes kind of like a switch case statement. Routes is equal to switch and route is equal to cases. Routes is equal to switch and route is equal to cases. Just like in switch case, there are different cases. Whenever there is a match in the case, switch case is going to execute that case. The same goes with these routes. Whenever the location changes, routes is going to look through all its children's, means look through all these routes and find the best match and render that branch of UI. Route elements may be nested. We'll look at that later. I hope you understand the difference between routes and route. Now inside this route, we can pass different properties. So here we can pass path of the URL. So for the app component, I'm going to pass the root URL, something like this. And then inside this, I'm going to specify element equal to sign, and in these curly braces, I'm going to call my app component. So I'm going to just self-close my app component. You can just self-close this route as well, something like this. I'm going to get rid of this closing route. Let me duplicate this two more times. For the second route, I'm going to specify invoice, and this is for the invoice component. So we have this invoice component inside the components folder, and inside that we have this invoice component. So let me just grab that. So at the top here, we need to say import invoice from, in the single quote, specify dot / specify components, and inside that we have invoice. Let me duplicate this and call the expenses, get rid of these invoices, and here we say expenses. So we are going to call both these components inside this index.js file. And let me just copy these invoices, and instead of this app, we specify this component, copy these expenses and specify that right here, and change this path to expenses. Save these changes, and now when you back to the root route, it's going to return the app component. When you click on the invoices, it's going to return the invoices component, and when you click on the expenses, it's going to render the expenses component. React Router DOM, it's going to render all these components without reloading the browser. You can create these components anywhere in the source folder. That's upon you, and you can link that component to the path. Next, we'll understand nested routes. Now, these are the basic routes. What if you want to create the nested routes? You may have noticed when clicking on these links, that will disappear the navigation menu. Repeating shared layouts is a pain. So let's see how to persist the layout using nested routes. Right now, when I click on the invoices, it's going to redirect us to the invoice URL and render the invoice component. It will do the same thing with expenses. But what I want when I click on the invoices or on the expenses, I want the app component layout as well. Right now, these invoices and these expenses routes are siblings to the app component. We want to make them children of the app route. By doing this, we can persist the layout, or you can say we can share the layout between components using nested routes. So what we are going to do is, instead of self-closing this route right here, I'm going to close this route, something like this. And inside this route, right here, I'm going to put both these siblings, something like this. Now let me save the changes. When I click on the invoices, you can see we're going to have the navigation menu and we are redirected to the invoices URL. When I click on the expenses, it will redirect to the expenses URL. But where is the UI? When the app route have children's, it does two things. It nests the URL and it will nest the UI component for share layout when the child route matches. So if you want to render the invoices and the expenses right down here, just out of this navigation menu, you have to call outlet in the parent component. The outlet should be used in the parent route elements to render their child route elements. This allows nested UI to show up when the child routes are rendered. If the parent route matches exactly, it will render a child index route or nothing if there is no index route. Let me show you the example. If I back to the app.js, let me just call here outlet, and we need to call this outlet right inside, just out of this navigation menu, right down here. I want to show the content of my children's right after the navigation menu. So I'm going to put the outlet right down here. Save this file. You can see when I save the changes, I'm going to have these expenses just out of this nav. When I click on the invoices, I'm going to have my invoices. So if the parent route match exactly, it will render the child index route. You can see this will persist the app layout and render child components. The parent route persists while the outlet swap between two childs. This will work at any level of route hierarchy. So if you want to add another nested route after these invoices, then you can do that as well. So let's suppose if you close this route and add another route here inside this invoices, something like this, with the path 1, 2, 3. And if I just print here a div with bills, when I save the changes, it's going to return an error message. This is because you have to pass the absolute route path inside this nested route. So what you have to do is, instead of just 1, 2, 3 or any other route path, you have to call this invoices / and then specify your route. Let me save the changes. Here you have your application. And now when you open route 1, 2, 3, it's going to print this division tag. Now you won't going to have this division tag until you have this outlet inside your invoices. So if you try to import the outlet from the React Router DOM and print that outlet inside these invoices, something like this, you can see you're going to have your bills inside your invoices. So that's upon you. You can make any level of route hierarchy inside this powerful nested routing. Now, once you understand how you can create nested routes and share the layouts between all the child elements, let's take a look at how you can list all the invoices in the application. Now, let's suppose that you have a JSON file with the invoices data. So let's assume that you have a JSON file. So let me create a JSON file inside this source folder. So I'm going to create here a JSON file inside these components. I'm going to create a new file and name this file data.js. And let's suppose this is a type of JSON file. Inside this file, I'm going to create a variable invoices. So I'm going to say here, let invoices is equal to, and pass an array of object. So I'm going to pass here an array, and inside this, I'm going to add different objects. So let me add here an object, something like this. So inside this object, we are going to have a name, number, amount, and the due date. So we have all this information of the invoice inside this object. Now, instead of just one object, I'm going to add here multiple objects. So I'm going to paste some objects here, something like this. So once we have multiple objects, what I want to create invoices using these objects. Let me first save the changes and then write down here, just after this array, here I'm going to say export function get invoices. Now to get all these invoices, I'm going to create here a function and I'm just going to return invoices variable. This one. I'm going to return this variable from this get invoices function. Let me save this file back to the invoices and right up here, I'm going to first import link from React Router DOM. And then I'm going to import get invoices. So I'm going to copy this get invoices function right from this data.js and import that inside this object. And we are going to get that from ./data.js. Now, just out that inside this component, I want to list all these invoices. To do that, I'm using map function. So inside this division tag, let me just get it off this div. And right here, I'm going to call main element. To this main, specify class names. Text center is the tailwind class to center all the text. Then I'm going to add here a division tag. And we're also going to add here class names. To this class, I'm going to specify flex column, and then specify here gap. Gap is going to be 3. So this will specify display flex to this division tag, and then specify flex direction column and add gap between all the columns. And inside this div, I'm going to iterate over this array of object. So first, we need to get invoices from this get invoices function. So inside this component, I'm going to say let invoices is equal to get invoices. So this function is going to return this array of object. You can notice here. And then I'm going to get that inside this variable. I'm going to grab this variable, specify that here inside this object. And I'm going to iterate over this object using JavaScript map function. And then inside this, I'm going to say invoice. I'm going to call here an arrow function, something like this, and return a link component. Now, as you know, we already imported this link component from the React Router DOM. To this link component, I'm going to specify some class names. So right down here, I'm going to specify class names. Class names is going to be bg gray 200. Then I'm going to specify to property, which is going to allow us to specify URLs. So to this to property, I'm going to specify the invoice number. Just for now, I'm going to leave this property as it is and then specify here key. You always need to specify here key because we are iterating over this component. So you need to uniquely identify this element and specify unique key to it. So I'm going to specify here invoice.number. Just out of that, to this to property, as you know, we can specify the URLs. And what we are going to do is right here inside this to, I'm going to specify template string and specify here / invoices, this path, this one. And inside this, I'm going to have the invoice number. So I'm going to specify / here, pass here $, curly braces, and then specify here invoice.number. Now let me save the changes. Now just out of that, once you specify to property, inside this link, right here, don't forget to specify text to this link. So I'm going to specify here invoice.name. As you know, we already have name property inside this object. So I'm going to specify that name here. Let me save this file and back to the browser and click on the invoices. When I click on it, you can see I'm going to have multiple links here. If I inspect this, if I open my application, the root division tag, and inside this, here we have the main component. Inside this main component, we have the division tag and different anchor tags. You can see to this anchor tags, we have the href attribute. And to this href attributes, we're going to have invoices and the invoice number. Whenever I click on this first link, this link is going to navigate us to this invoice number. And it will do the same for all these anchor tags. So using this technique, you can list all your invoices in your application. So when you click on the link, it will navigate you to the invoices URL. So let's suppose if I click on this first link, you can see now in the URLs, I have the invoices 1995. And if you're back to your data, we have the first invoice, which is 1995. So this is the invoice number. And we have this invoice number inside the URL. And now if you want, you can use this invoice number to display the invoice information. We'll look at that later. Just for now, just look at this URL. First, we have the invoices, and inside that, we have the invoice number. This is because here inside these invoices, we first specify the invoices and then specify the invoice number. If you want to display your invoices right inside the root URL, you can get rid of these invoices right from here. Now you can notice when you click on these links, the page goes blank. That is because none of the route we have defined match the URL. So if you back to the index.js, then you can notice we only have 3 routes inside this index file, and none of the routes is matching to this URL. So what we need to do is we need to create matching routes, or we can create no matching route. In this case, you will notice we don't know any invoice number. In that case, we need to add no matching routes inside this application. To create no matching routes, what you have to do is you have to add another route inside this index file, and you have to specify here route, close this, and inside this route you have to specify path, and inside this path you specify asterisk. This asterisk has a special meaning here. It will match only when no other routes do. So it means if we don't have the matching routes to this URL, I want to execute this no matching route. So inside this no matching route, I can easily specify element. Now that's upon you. You can create and specify inline element as well. So you can create here main like this, and then specify here a paragraph, then specify here there is nothing here, and you can specify here some tailwind classes as well. So I'm going to specify here text 3 XL, and to this main I can specify text center to center the content. Let me save this. You can see I'm going to have here there is nothing here. This is because we don't have any sync component with this URL. So this is what we call the no match route. Now next, let's understand how you can read this parameter and access the value of this invoice and display them inside a component. Now, once you understand how you can create no matching routes in your React application, let me show you how you can access the parameter value so you can access your data from the database. So let's suppose that you have this data from your backend and you have this invoice number inside your URL. What you have to do is you have to access this invoice parameter number and display the invoice information inside your application. Let me show you how you can do that. Inside your application, I'm going to create a new component. Inside this components folder, I'm going to name this component bills.js. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this component. Here I'm going to say export default, and the name of this function is bills. After that, here I'm going to return h1 heading tag and say, oops, I think I misspelled here, default. It's a type of function. Here I'm going to add h1 heading tag and say invoice, and then specify here hash and specify the invoice number. So let's suppose that I want to display my invoice number right here. Let me save this file back to the invoice. Now what I would like to render the invoice number instead of this 123. Normally in the React, we would pass this number as a property, but as you know, you don't control this information because it comes from the URL. So let's define a route that will match this kind of URLs and then enable us to get the invoice number from it. Save this file and back to the index.js. Right here, what I'm going to do is, as you know, we have this invoices route. I'm going to just add another route inside these invoices. So let me first close this route, something like this. And inside this invoices route, I'm going to create another route. So I'm going to say here route and then specify here path. Now, as you know, I don't know the number of the invoices. So what I can do is I can simply create here a variable. To create a variable, we need to start with colon and then specify here invoice ID. Now this is a variable, and this variable is going to get the value from the parameter. Just for now, I'm going to specify this variable. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this variable. Then you specify the element. Here inside this element, as you know, we have this bills component. So let me just print that bills component. So inside this index right up here, I'm going to say import bills from the component bills. And I'm going to print this component right inside this element, something like this. Now you can notice this invoice path is the URL parameter, meaning it can match any value as long as the parameter is the same. So this path is only going to match when there is a number inside this invoices. And you can notice we put this route inside this invoices route. So this is going to add a second layer of route nesting when it matches because it's a child route. Now let me click on this invoices and show you the result. So let's suppose if I click on this link, note that the URL changes, but the new invoice component doesn't show up yet. This is because we need to add an outlet in the parent component. So inside this invoices, at the top, right here, we need to first import outlet, copy this component, and at the end, just before this closing main, right here, I'm going to call this outlet. Let me save the changes. You can see at the end, you have the invoice number. So whenever you change your link, it's going to display your bill's number. You can notice right now it's displayed the default number. This is because inside your bills, we have this hard-coded value. What I want to get this URL parameter right inside these bills and display the invoice number inside this application. So what I want to get the parameter value in the component. So let me just get the parameter using a function called useParams. So inside your child bills component right here, we specify import in the object. I'm going to say useParams, and you get this function from React Router DOM. And this is a type of hook. So you call that hook inside a component. So we specify here let params is equal to, and you call that useParams hook, something like this. And this hook is read-only. So you're just going to access the value of the parameter. Now just out of that, if I console.log this params, let me save the changes, open the console. Then you can notice if I reload the browser, I'm going to have here a property called invoices. And we have here 200 because the parameter value is 200. Now you can notice we created this invoice ID variable when we created this route. So if you back to the index.js, then you can notice we created this invoice ID variable when we created this bills route. Now if you want to change this invoice ID variable, then you can do that as well. So let's suppose if I say ID number, if I save the changes, you can see this is going to change the property name invoice ID number, and we have this value to this property. So that's about you. You can specify any name to this variable. For this example, I'm using invoice ID. I'm going to access this invoice ID inside these bills using this property invoice ID. So let me just pass here dot and say invoice ID. Let me save this. I can easily access this value, this parameter value. So what I can do is I can grab this variable and then get rid of this statement right from here. And then here I can pass curly braces and say parameter invoice, something like this. Save the changes, close this console. And now when I click on these links, you can see I can get the invoice number very easily. Now we know that how we can get the params and get the value from the parameter. But having only the invoice number inside your application is not a good idea. Instead, you have to print all the information of your invoices in the application when you have your invoice ID. So let me show you how you can get the information of your invoice from the data.json file. As you know, you have your invoice number inside your URL. Using this invoice number, you can get all the information of this invoice. So to get the information of your invoice using the invoice number, you can create a function inside your data.json file. Here you can say export function get invoice, and here I can call invoices.find method. As you know, inside this invoices variable, I have an array of object. So I'm going to filter that array of object using find method. So inside this find method, we are going to pass invoices, the parameter. So I'm going to call here just invoice and then call here the callback function. And using this function, we are going to find and return the invoice. So what we need to do is we need to first get the invoice number. So using this get invoice, I'm going to pass here a parameter called number. So when we call the function get invoice, I'm going to pass this URL value. Just out of that, right inside this callback here, I'm going to say if the invoice dot number. So I'm going to call this parameter invoice dot number if it is equal to number. You can see I'm strictly check the equality of the number. So if we have the same number in both these variables, then return that object. Now this find method is going to iterate over all the objects and find this number. If it finds that number inside an object, it's going to return that object. So let me just get that object. So instead of getting that object inside a variable, I'm just going to say here return. So I'm just going to return that object from this getInvoice function. Something like this. That's it. Let me save these changes. Back to the builds. Right here, as you know, inside these invoices, we have the current invoice number. So whenever you click on the links, you will have the invoice number. Now let me just use this invoice ID and find the invoice number and display them inside this application. So let me get rid of this h1 heading tag right from here. And here I'm going to return main with some tailwind classes. So I'm going to specify here class name flex column. And then I'm going to specify padding by 5. So this will add top and bottom padding, add border and margin by 4. So this will add top and bottom margin. Then I'm going to add width, which is 1 by 3. So this is going to add 33.33% width to this main section, and then add MX auto. So this is going to center all the content. Just start that inside this main. Here I'm going to add h2 and add total due. So what we need to do is we need to first get the invoice object from this function, from this get invoice. So to get that, back to the builds, right up here, you have to say import in the object you call get invoice from, just for that right down here. As you know, you have this get invoice. So call this function, and inside this function, you need to specify a number to find your invoice. So as you know, you have your number inside this params. So we call here params dot invoice ID, this variable, this one. Just for that, this function is going to return the invoice. So let me get that. So I'm going to say here let invoice is equal to. So once we have the invoice inside this variable, I can display all the information of the invoice inside this application. I can simply specify here curly braces and say invoice dot amount. This is going to print the amount. Then I'm going to add here a paragraph. Inside the curly braces, I'm going to say invoice dot name, call here colon, and then specify here invoice dot number. And just for that, I'm going to add here a paragraph and then specify here due date. In the curly braces, I'm going to specify invoice dot due. So I'm going to print here due date, and here I'm going to print the due amount. And inside this paragraph, I'm going to print the invoice name and its number. Let me save the changes and show you the result. You can see I'm going to get an error message. Cannot read property of undefined, which is amount. If you're back to the data.json, then you will notice we have the amount property to all my invoices. But the problem here is, if you open the get invoice, then you can notice I use here strict equality to check the number. So when you pass number to the get invoice, make sure the invoice number is a type of number. So what we have to do is we have to convert this into integer. So we cut this statement right from here and say parse int. And inside this function, I'm simply going to specify params dot invoice ID. Let me save the changes. You can see I don't have any errors here. And now you can see I'm going to have my invoice detail. That's super easy, right? So I'm going to have all the invoice detail inside this invoice. And now let's suppose that you want to remove these links right from this URL. And you want to print and open this URL in the new tab. For that, you have to just specify here to this link component, you have to specify target is equal to, in the double quote, you specify blank. So this is going to open this link inside a new tab. Let me save the changes. And whenever I click on these links, you can see it's going to open a new tab, and I'm going to have my invoice inside that tab. But what I want to remove these links from this new tab. So to remove this link from these new tabs, we have to back to the index.js, and instead of this child bills, I can grab this child bills right from here and put that after this invoices, something like this. And instead of this colon invoice ID, we pass here / invoices and then specify / again. So this route is refers to the invoices. Let me save the changes. You can see now I'm going to have my invoice on the new tab. Let me close this tab, back to my previous tab. When I click on these links, it will open a new tab and I'm going to have my invoice. You can see that's super easy, right? Now let's talk about the index route. Index routes is most important concept in React Router DOM. As you know, inside this invoice.js file, we use this outlet to display the invoice. So you can notice here inside this result, whenever you click on the invoice, only then you will have your invoice. Until then, you have this blank space right down here. Note, when you click on the invoice, the main content area goes blank. So what we have to do is we have to fill this blank space using index route. What we need to do is we need to back to the index.js right here. As you know, we have this invoice route here. Inside this invoice route, I'm going to create another route. I'm going to specify here route, something like this. Close this route component. Here we pass property index. Now this property tells the route that this is a type of index route. Just saw that. We specify here element and then specify my own element here. So let's suppose if I create here a main component, something like this, and add a paragraph here, select and invoice, specify here class names of Tailwind. So I'm going to say here text center and padding by 5. That's upon you. You can create this component inside this component folder. That's upon you. I'm going to leave everything as it is. Save this file. You can see the blank space is now filled with this component. And now whenever you click on the link, it's going to fill that blank space. And when you back to your invoice again, it will display a message, select an invoice. So you can see the index route fills the empty space. Notice that it has this index property instead of this path property. That is because the index route shares the path of the parent. So this index is sharing the path of this parent route. So here the index is equal to the invoices URL of the parent. The index route rendered in the parent route outlet at the parent route path. It means this index route is rendered inside this parent route outlet. Whenever you have your outlet inside your parent route, the index route is displayed using this parent route outlet with the use of parent URL. Now keep in mind, index route match when the parent route matches, but none of the other children matches. So whenever there is a match to the parent, index route will automatically call. You can also consider this index route as a default child route of the parent route. So whenever there is a match to your parent path, the index route will automatically execute. But keep in mind, you're only going to have your index route when you have outlet inside your parent component. Now let's suppose I want to change this display location of this index route. I can just move this outlet right from here and then specify that at the top right here. Save the changes. You can see I'm going to have this index route at the top. But when I click on the links, I'm going to have my invoices at the top. So I hope you understand the index routes of the React Router DOM. Now, whenever you click on these links, to consider the active link, you have to remember this UI or this URL. But in the React Router DOM, you have a component which allows you to specify active link. Let's see how we can add active links inside this application. Active links means to display the link as an active link which the user is looking at. So what we need to do is, instead of this link component, we are going to import the NavLink component. So just out of this link, I'm going to call here NavLink. Now this is also a component, but this component is used to display active link. Sometimes you want to display active links to the user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this NavLink and replace that with this link component, something like this. Now when I save the changes, you're not going to see any effect. Now what you have to do is you have to tell this NavLink component that when we click on the link, I want to change the color of the text. We need to call style property to this NavLink. So we call here style is equal to, and inside these curly braces, here I'm going to call a function, the arrow function. And just out of that, inside this style function, you can get, right inside this parenthesis, you are going to get an argument. The argument is going to be is active. Using this variable, you're going to get true and false value. And using that true and false value, you can change the style of this active link. Let me show you how. Inside the style, you can return an object and change the color of this text. So I'm going to specify here color, specify colon, and then specify value to it. So if I specify here red, then this is just going to specify red color to all these links. But what if I use this is active variable? So as I said, this is active is going to return true or false value. It's going to return true when we click on the link, otherwise return false. So I'm going to grab this is active, specify that here, call here question mark, and call here ternary if and else statement, something like this. If this is active is true, then return red color, otherwise return nothing. You can see it's only going to color the active link. If I change and click on the other link, you can see it's going to change the link and we have the active link color. And now let's suppose that you want to specify hex color inside this double quote. Then you can do that as well. So you can just specify here hex value and save the changes. You're going to have hex color to this text. Now you're not limited to only specify style to this link component. You can also specify class name attribute. So let me just comment this style and let me just comment this class name as well. So let's suppose that you want to specify a specific class when you have the active link. In that case, you can specify here class name. In this curly braces, you're simply going to call a function like this. And then inside this parenthesis, you call here is active. And then inside this class name here, you're going to call is active question mark. And then inside the double quote, you're simply going to call the class name. Just for now, I'm going to call the Tailwind CSS class name, which is text red 400, pass here colon and the false value. So if this is active is true, then I'm going to return this class, otherwise return nothing. Now what you have to do is you have to return this statement. So instead of these curly braces, you can just going to specify this statement. So when you save the changes, you're going to have the result something like this. Now because I don't have this BG grade 200 to these links, that is why this is going to remove the background from these links. If I want to add one more class here, I can do that as well. And then if you want, you can make a list of classes inside a variable. So inside your function, let's suppose if you create here a variable, active class name is equal to, and you specify all your Tailwind classes here. And you are going to call these active classes right here. Save the changes, you're going to get the same result. Because now, instead of having all the classes inside this function, you create a variable and store all your Tailwind classes there. So this is how you can use NavLink in your application. Now let's talk about the search parameter. Search parameters are like URL parameters, but they sit in a different position in the URL. Instead of being in the normal URL separated by forward slashes, they are at the end after a question mark. You have seen them across the web, something like this. useRouter makes it easy to read and manipulate search parameter with useSearchParams function. It works a lot like React useState, but store and set the state in the URL search parameter instead of the memory. Let me show you what I want to say. At the top, right up here, I'm going to first import a hook, which is useSearchParam. And we're going to grab this hook from React Router DOM. So we are using this hook to create the search params inside this application. Now, let me just get rid of this unwanted previous lecture code right from here, something like this. And now what I want to use this useSearchParams hooks inside this invoice component. So right down here, I'm going to say let, and in the array, you're going to destructure two values. First is the variable. So we call here search params, and second is the set search params. And then I'm going to specify this useSearchParams as a hook. So this hook is going to destructure two values inside an array. First is a search parameter, and second is set search parameters. That's upon you. You can specify any name to these variables. Now this array is just like the use state. The first is the variable and the second is a function. So let's suppose if I console.log these search params. Let me save the changes. Oops, I think I misspelled here. I need to specify here this color. Save this. Let me open my console and reload the browser. You can see I'm going to get here a response inside this console. I'm going to get here URL search parameter, and we don't have any value inside this object. We didn't set any value using this set search parameter. So you can notice here the default value of this URL search parameters is an empty object. Now what I want to search through all these links using input text box. So right down here, just out of this div, here I'm going to say input. This is a type of text, and then I'm going to add some attributes here. So we first specify here class name, border, width is going to be 3x4, and mx is going to be auto. And then I'm going to add margin top 5. Let me save this. So I'm going to have this input text box here. You can notice just out of that. Let me add here a placeholder. Placeholder is going to be search invoice. Just out of that, I'm going to specify value to this input text box. Now, because I want to access the value of the search parameter and specify that to this input text box, that is why I specify value attribute to this input text box. So what I want to specify value of this search parameter to this input text box. That is why here I'm going to call value, and then inside these curly braces, here I'm going to say search params, this variable dot get. Using this get method, you can get the value from the search params. So I'm going to call here get and pass here parenthesis. You have to specify name. I'm going to specify name filter, and then I'm going to say here if this value is not available, then I'm going to return nothing. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say on change. So I'm going to call here on change event handler. Now just out of that, right up here, let me get rid of this console.log and create a simple event handler here. So I'm going to say here function on input change, and don't forget to pass here event parameter, because using this event parameter we can access the value of this input text box. So let me first pass here on input change like this handler function. Let me call here a command and say input handler function, and right down here I'm going to say let filter is equal to event dot target dot value. Now this statement is going to return the value of this input text box inside this variable. Just down here I'm going to say if we have filter, if we have value inside this filter variable, then return if statement, otherwise return else statement. So in the if statement, I'm simply going to say set search parameter. I'm going to call this function set search parameter. This set search parameter is going to allow us to specify value, or you can say create a value inside this variable. So I'm going to call here set search parameter, and inside this I'm going to call an object and say here filter. Now as you know, you get this value from the get method. If you scroll down, we specify here dot get and specify the variable name, which is filter. You have to specify the same name inside this set search parameter. Just out of that, what if you don't have any value inside this input text box? In that case, we call this set search parameter and get rid of this filter from here. So we pass the default value to this function when we don't have any value inside this search box. Now just out of that, right down here, let me just say console.log and call here search params. Let me save the changes. When I reload the browser and type something inside this input text box, oops, I think I misspelled something. Cannot read properties of undefined value. Right here. Oops, I think I misspelled here. It's a target. Let me save the changes, reload the browser, and now when I type something here, I'm going to get the search parameter as a response. But you can notice inside this URL, I have here a question mark, and after that, I'm going to get the filter, the variable name, and its value. You can see filter is a key which we set here, and we specify value to it of this input text box. So whatever we type here, I'm going to have that value inside this URL. And now I can use this value to filter the links. So let's see how to do it. Let me get rid of this console.log, save this file, reload the browser. And now you can see when I reload the browser, I'm still going to have this value inside this text box. This is because now I'm getting this value from the parameter. Now, just out of that, what I want to get this parameter search value and filter these links. To do that, right down here, just out of this input text box, right down here, I'm going to call an object. And inside this, I'm going to say invoices. Let me just call all the invoices variable dot filter. And what I want to filter is, I want to filter the name. I want to search all this list by its name. So if you back to the data, then you can see I'm going to have here a name property. So I'm going to just back to the invoices, and right down here inside this filter, I'm going to first iterate over invoice. So this will iterate over all the object using this callback function. Inside this invoice, we can access all the properties of this object. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say let filter is equal to search params dot get. And what I want to get is, I want to get the filter variable, this one. So I'm going to specify that filter here. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say if I don't have any value inside this filter, then return true. But if I have value inside this filter, then I'm going to say let name is equal to invoice dot name. I'm going to access this value, this one, dot, and then I'm going to say here to lowercase. I'm going to convert this value into lowercase. And just out of that, at the end, I'm going to return name, this variable, dot start with, and inside this function, I'm going to return filter dot to lowercase. So I'm going to get this input text box value inside this variable, convert that into lowercase. Then I'm going to get the name from this object, convert that into lowercase, and using this start with function, I'm going to just return that object. So what we are going to do is, if this link starts with S, then I'm going to filter that object and return from this function. And just out of that, instead of these invoices, now I can call map directly this chain. So right down here, I can say dot map like this, invoice, and then I can return this NavLink, this one. So grab this NavLink and specify that right here. Something like this. Let me get rid of this statement. Save these changes. Get rid of this parameter value. And now, if I try to search for this ocean, if I type here O, then you can see it will automatically filter that link for me. And at the top, you can see the filter is equal to O. And if I search for wind open space, if I type W, I'm going to have that value. If I type here S, I'm going to have two links starts with S. So what we have done here, the use search parameter is now returning the URL search parameter with filter as one of its value. We set that value to the input whenever it's filter the search param. But keep in mind, the search parameter value is not stored in a memory. Instead, it's stored in the URL. So this is how you can easily filter your invoice. Now, when you click on the invoice, it will display the invoice, but reset the search params. Let me show you. If I click on the invoice, you can see it will reset the URL, and we have to search for the same invoice again. Now, let's see how to solve this problem. Now, we all know how we can use search params to filter all the links. But when I filter a link and try to click on the link, it will reset this URL. Now, what I want to persist this search result. We can persist the query string when we click on the link by adding it to the link's href. We'll do that by composing the NavLink and the useLocation from the React Router DOM into our own link component. Now, let's suppose that if I create another component right down here, That's for you can create this component inside a dedicated file as well. Just for this example, I'm going to create here a function, name this function result now link. Now this is my own custom component, and right down here inside this custom component, I'm going to call useLocation hook. So at the top, we need to first say useLocation. The useLocation hook is used to access the current location. So I'm going to say here let location is equal to useLocation. Now using this useLocation, I can access my current location. Now just for that, I'm going to return NavLink component right from this result NavLink. But what I have to do is I have to combine this current location as well as properties. So at the top right here, I'm going to call an object, and inside this, I'm going to say here to and call here spread operator and say props. Just for that, I'm going to call this props right here. So let me first specify here 2, and then I'm going to specify this parameter value, which is 2. And I'm going to combine this value with the location. So I'm going to say here location dot search. Now because I'm using use parameter to filter the input text box, I can access the value of the use parameters using this search property. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine the current location plus the search parameter value, and I'm going to specify that to this href attribute, or you can say to this to property. And then if you want to specify your own custom properties to this custom component, then you can call here a spread operator and then specify this props here, something like this. That's it. Now this is your own NavLink component. Just for that, let me just open my invoices and get rid of this NavLink, and then specify my own result NavLink component here. Let me save the changes and show you the result. And now if I search for the invoice and click on any invoice, you can see this is not going to reset this search URL, and I can easily search between these invoices. Now let me just console.log this location. If I say here location.search, save the changes, open the console, then you can see here I'm going to have filter S. I'm combining the two with this search location. It means if I try to console.log again the to value, this one, save the changes, reload the browser, then you can notice here I have my URL, and then I'm going to combine that with this filter. So this is going to return the URL what I want, and I'm going to save that URL inside this use location and return that to this component. So whenever I search for my link and click on this invoice, I'm going to have my URL as it is. But sometimes you want to update the URL when there is a change in the backend data. For example, let's suppose the user delete this invoice. We need to persist and delete the invoice instantly. Let me show you what I want to say. So let's add a button that marks the invoice as paid and then navigate us to the index route. So let me first create a function inside this data.js file. Right here, I'm going to create a function to delete the invoice. So I'm going to say here export function delete invoice, and then I'm going to pass here invoice number. So I'm going to say here number, and then I'm simply going to say here return invoice dot filter, and inside this filter I'm going to say invoice. I'm going to grab the individual invoice and say invoice dot number. If it is not equal to number, then return all the objects. Now this condition is just an opposite of this get invoice condition. Let me save the changes, back to the bills. I'm going to back to the bills.js, and right down here in just out of this paragraph, here I'm going to create a button. I'm going to specify button and add on click event on it. Let me first specify text here, delete. And I'm going to specify here on click event, and inside this on click event, I'm going to call an handler function. Inside this handler function, I'm first going to call this delete invoice function. So let me grab this and import that right here at the top. Delete invoice, and then right down here, I'm going to call that delete invoice function and then specify the invoice dot number. I'm going to grab this invoice right from this variable and then specify the number property. Let me save the changes. If you click on the delete button, it's not going to do anything. This is because if you back to the data.json, I'm just going to return the object right from this function. What I want to delete the object from this global invoices variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify here invoices is equal to, and then specify here invoices.filter and call my condition. Let me save the changes back to the invoices, save this file, reload the browser, and now when I open the invoice, click on the delete button, it's not going to delete that invoice. You have to do some extra work to delete these links from this application. At the top, we need to call two hooks. First is useNavigate, and second is useLocation. The useNavigate is used to navigate us to the different location, or you can say to the different route. Right down here, I'm going to call this useNavigate. So at the top, let me first say let navigate is equal to useNavigate. This is a type of hook. So we call here hook and specify that to the variable. And right down here, I'm going to say navigate and call this a function. This function is used to navigate us to the new location. Just out of that, I'm using here useLocation. So I'm going to copy this, specify that here let location is equal to useLocation. And as you know, useLocation is used to get the current URL location. So right inside this navigate here, I'm going to say double quote / invoices, the invoices route, this one, and then specify here plus location dot search. Let me save the changes back to the invoices and search for the invoice. Now when I click on the delete button, you can see it's going to delete that invoice, and we're going to have the default index route as a response. If I back to the invoices again, you can see this will delete that object from the list. Now if I click on this first invoice and delete that right from the list, you can see this is going to delete that invoice, and I'm going to have the default index route as a response. Now if you reload the browser, it will automatically add all this default data from this file. We are not deleting this data from this file. Instead, we are just deleting the object from the memory. So with the help of useNavigate and useLocation, you can easily delete your data. That's it. I hope you understand the main concepts of React Router DOM. Next, let me show you how you can use all these concepts in the real world examples. Now, let's understand how to build authentication real world example using React Router. I'm going to use all the main concepts we learned so far to build this application. Oftentimes, when building a web app, you'll need to protect certain routes in your application from the users who don't have the proper authentication. Protected routes let us choose which routes user can visit based on whether they are logged in. For example, you might have the home page route that you want anyone accessing, like a landing page, a price page, or the login page. Protected routes should only be available to the user that are logged in, like the dashboard or settings. So when you click on this login button, we successfully log in inside the application, and then we have the dashboard and the setting page. And you can access this page only when you are the authorized user. Otherwise, you can't access both this page. We can protect this route using authentication. And when you click on the logout, it will disappear both that authenticated tab right from the application. Now, let's take a look at how you can build this application. So to make this application, you have to first open the Visual Studio Code and create a new React application. As you know, we are using React Router app to learn all the main concepts of React Router DOM. Now what we have to do is we have to create another fresh React application with the command npx create React app and then specify your application name. I'm choosing the application name Auth app. I had this app inside this project directory. You can notice. Now if you want, you can clone this app from the link provided in the description. Once you clone the app, you can follow along with me from this tutorial. If I open my package.json file, then you can notice here, I have here a library called Tailwind CSS, and we have two more libraries here. I already set up Tailwind CSS inside this project, so you don't need to worry about the styling. So what you have to do is you have to just clone this project and enter into the project directory and specify a command called npm start. This command is going to start the development server on the local host 3000. Now once we have the project, let me just toggle this window on the right side, something like Now, the very first thing you need to do is you have to install the React Router DOM inside your application. If you're back to the package.json file, you can notice I don't have the React Router DOM module inside this project. So what I have to do is I have to open the terminal and open a new terminal. And here I'm going to first enter into the Auth app and then specify here a command called npm I for install and then specify the package name, which is React Router DOM. And I'm going to install this package as a development dependency. So I'm going to install this. Once I have this package, let me clear the screen. And now if I back to my package.json file, you can notice I'm going to have this React Router DOM module. Now, once I have this package, let me just use that. Back to the index.js. Here at the top, you need to first import a wrapper to your application. So we call here browser router. And you get this from React Router DOM. Now, just for that, you have to specify this browser router as a wrapper to your application. So I'm going to just add this browser router, something like this, and put my application inside this browser router. So this is the first thing you have to do with your application. And now let's make different routes inside your app component. So at the top here, I'm going to say import. In the object, you need to call routes and route. And you have to call these classes from the module React Router DOM. Just so that instead of this division tag, right here, I'm going to say routes. And inside this route, we have route. And to this route, we specify path property. And this is for the home route. So we call here / and then specify the element. Right now, instead of creating any element, I'm just going to add here a division tag and then specify here home. Let me duplicate this statement. And this route is for login. So we call here login and change the path to login. Let me duplicate this 2 more times. And then this is for dashboard. And this is for setting. So we call this path right here. This is for setting and this is for dashboard. Now in the previous lectures, we call these routes inside this index.js file. That's upon you. You can create and call these routes in any component. So we build these routes inside this app and then call this app inside this index.js file. Just for that, I'm going to save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the home route. If I open the login route, I'm going to have the login. If I open the dashboard, it will open the dashboard component. And if I open the settings, it's going to open the setting component. So all these routes is now working. But what I want, instead of using this route, I'm going to use useRoute hook to build all these routes. Now we all know how we can use these routes inside the React application. Now what I want to show you how you can use useRoute hook inside the React application to build this same routing. So let's see how to do it. Now, previously, we understand how we can use these routes inside the React application. But what I want, instead of using these routes as a component, let me show you how you can use useRoute hook to build the same routing. So at the top, instead of this route and route, we're going to call here a hook called useRoutes. So we call here useRoutes. And then you call this useRoutes right here. So instead of this return statement, you call here constant routes is equal to useRoutes, something like this. And inside these routes, you have an array of routes. So you call here an array, and inside this array, you have all your routes. So inside this array, you have to first add an object, and inside that object, you have your route path. So we call here an object like this, and then we specify different properties. So what we have to do is we have to first specify the path of the route. So we pass here path. We can call the path using the path property, and then this is for the root route. So I'm going to pass here /. Then I'm going to pass here comma, and for this path, I'm using the home element, or you can say for this path, I'm using the home component. So I'm going to specify here element colon, and then pass here my home component. As you know, I don't have any home component right now, so I'm going to add here a division tag with home text, something like this. Just for that, let me do the same right down here. So let me copy this, specify that here. Don't forget to pass here a comma because this is the second object and this is for login. So we call here login. Let me duplicate this, specify that here. This is for dashboard. So we call here dashboard, something like this. Let me duplicate this object, and at the last time, I'm going to specify here settings. And this is for settings. Let me save the changes. You're not going to get anything. This is because right now this app is not returning anything. So what we have to do is we have to return these routes from this app. So right down here, just after this array, here I'm going to say return routes. Save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the result what I want. If I back to the home, I'm going to have the home component. If I back to the login, I'm going to have the login component. And if I open the dashboard, I'm going to have my dashboard component. So using this technique, you can easily create multiple routes. Now what I want to make this login, this path, and this setting route as a child of this home component. So to make that, you specify here a comma and you call another property here with the name children. And to this children, you call an array. And this array is also going to have an array of objects. So you're simply going to call here an object and pass all your routes. So instead of creating a new routes here, I can copy all these routes because I wanted to make these routes as a child of my home component. So I'm going to put all these objects inside this array, something like this. When you save the changes, you're going to have the result something like this. You have the home component. When you open the login, you're going to get the same home component. This is because inside this element, right now you don't have the outlet component. So if at the top, if you call outlet, and if you call this outlet right here, let's suppose if I call here outlet, something like this, save the changes, then you can see I'm going to have my login inside my application. So if I open the dashboard, it will open the dashboard. If I open the setting, it will open the setting page. So now the login, dashboard, and settings are the child of this home component. Now what if you back to the home component and you want to print your index route as well? So inside this children, you can do that as well. So just call here an object. Don't forget to pass here a comma because this is a new object. And inside this, you call index route. So we pass here index and then specify value true. And don't forget to specify element. So I'm going to specify here element. So I'm just going to call here a div and then specify here home content. Let me save the changes. You can see to the blank space, you're going to have your index route. And when you open your login route, you're going to have your login component. So this is how you can add index routes inside this useRoute. Now, if you want, let's suppose that you want to add children to this login. You're simply going to add here a comma and then specify here children and then specify colon. And in the array, you specify your children list. So you can do the same thing for all these objects. That's upon you. So this is a very simple technique to create routes inside your application. So now once you understand how you can use useRoute hook to create different routes inside your application, let's take a look at how we can create all these components for all these routes. As you know, we are just using here a division tag to represent this route. So I'm going to create a new folder inside this source, name this folder components, and inside this folder, I'm going to create a new file. Name this file global.js. Now that's upon you. You can specify any name to this file. Inside this file, I'm going to add all my components. Now that's upon you. You can create dedicated files for all these components. But just for this example, I'm going to put all my components inside this global.js file. So it will be easy to add all that components inside the app.js file. Right here, I'm going to say export constant login page. So this is my first component and I'm going to return an arrow function from it. And then I'm going to return a division tag with h1 heading tag. And then I'm going to say here login component. Just out of that, let me copy this component, paste that here and say here home page. This is the home page component. So I'm going to say here home component. Just out that, let me copy this home page component, specify that here, and this is the home content component. So I'm going to specify name to this component, home content. So I'm going to specify that name here, home content component. Let me just copy this and specify that here. And then I'm going to create now component. So I'm going to say here now. Let me change this text to now. Let me duplicate the component again. And this is for the dashboard. So I'm going to say here dashboard. And this is the dashboard component. And at the last right here, I'm going to say setting. So I'm going to say here settings. And this is for the settings component. So I'm going to say here settings. Something like this. Now I can access all these components inside my app.js. Let me save the changes. Back to the app.js. And at the top, right up here, I can simply say import. In the object, I can import all my components from /components global.js file. So here I'm going to say login page, home content page, dashboard, settings, and then I'm going to call all these components right here. So what I'm going to do is for this home component here, I'm going to say home page. So let me get rid of this division tag, and here I'm going to call home page, this component. Then for this index route here, I'm going to say home content, this component. For the login page, as you know, we have the login page component. For the dashboard, we have dashboard component. And for the settings, we have the settings component. So I'm going to import all these components and specify to the corresponding URLs. Right now, you're not going to get the child routes. This is because inside the global components, inside the home page, here, I don't have the outlet. So at the top, right up here, I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to say outlet from React Router DOM. And then I'm going to copy this outlet and specify that inside this home page right here. Let me just grab this home page and put that at the top so we can easily access it. Save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the result what I want. If I open the login page, I'm going to have the login component. And if I open the dashboard, I'm going to have the dashboard component. Now, just out of that, instead of just this division tag, let me add some Tailwind classes to this home component and add title to this application. So inside this home page right here, let me just first convert this div into main component. So we will understand this is the starting of the main page. And then to this h1 here, I'm going to specify text authentication. Then specify here classes. So let me add some Tailwind classes here. Text center, then add margin y3, and then I'm going to add here bg yellow 400. So this will add the background color to this h1 heading tag. Just out of that, I'm going to specify text gray 700. So this will specify text color to this title, and then I'm going to specify width, which is going to be 40 mx auto and rounded. Save the changes. Just out of that, let me back to my home page. So just out of that, just out of this h1 heading tag, right down here, I'm going to add division tag like this and specify here class names. Class names is going to be flex. I'm going to call display flex to this division tag. Then I'm going to specify justify center to center all the content. Also specify text center to center the text, and then specify padding by 3. So this will add top and bottom padding. And then I'm going to put this outlet inside this division tag right here. So I'm going to specify display flex to all my outlet content. Inside this home page, just out of this h1 heading tag, here I want the navigation menu. So what I'm going to do is, here you can see I have this now component. I'm going to grab this now component and specify that right here. I'm going to have this navigation component right after this title. You can see. Just out of that, I'm going to back to the navigation component right here. Instead of this div, I'm going to specify here now To this now, I'm going to specify some class names. So I'm going to first specify flex, bg indigo 500, text gray 50, gap is going to be 4, and justify center. So this will just center all the navigation items. Just out of that, here I'm going to add a link component. So at the top, let me first import that link component. So I'm going to say here link. I'm going to get this link component from the React router DOM. And then I'm going to specify here first to attribute. To is going to be the root route. Then I'm going to specify the root route. Here I'm going to specify home. Duplicate this link multiple times. This is for login. Specify here text login. Then I'm going to specify here dashboard. And this is for setting. And do the same for this path. So I'm going to say here settings and dashboard. Let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the result what I want. I'm going to have all my links as a navigation menu to this application. Next, I'm going to add authentication inside this app so we can protect the routes. Now, once you understand how you can create this beautiful navigation menu inside this application, what I want to protect this dashboard and this setting routes from the unauthorized user. Before we go about creating our protected routes, we'll need a way to figure out if the user is authenticated. We can create the fake authentication hook to determine the user authentication status. Let me show you what I want to say. Here, I'm going to create a new file inside my project. Inside the source directory, here I'm going to create a new folder. Name this folder hooks. And inside this hooks, I'm going to create a new file. Name this file auth.js. Now what I want to create here a store so we can access the same value in all my components. So as you know, we have different components inside this application. What I want to create a central store for all these components so we can access the same object in any of these components. So let's suppose that inside this app, we have an object called auth. And this object is going to have auth property with the value true. I want to access this object in all my components. To do that, I can use Redux. But instead of using Redux for this small application, we can simply use createContext hook of React. If you want to know more about React hooks, then I have a complete course on it. You can check out that course from the link provided in the description. Just for now, let's understand how we can use Context API to create this central store. I'm simply going to first import React hooks. So I'm going to say here object from React. And from this React, I'm going to import createContext. And just out of the store, here I'm going to say constant initial state is equal to, and inside an object, I'm going to pass auth false. Now this is my object, and I wanted to access this object in all my components so I can authorize the user. Right now, the user status is false, means unauthorized. So just out of this initial state, right down here, I'm going to create a context. To create a context, you need to call here createContext hook, this one. And inside this, here, you specify the initial state. So I'm going to call this initial state and specify that to this createContext. And then I'm going to say here constant and then name this auth context. Now, just out of that, you have to call this auth context as a wrapper to your app component. So instead of adding this auth context inside this index.js, we can simply call here a function. And then we can call that function inside the index.js file. Let me show you what I want to say. Here I'm going to call a command and say auth provider. And then here I'm going to create and export a function. Name this function auth provider like this. And this is going to return this auth context, this one. So I'm going to call here auth context, something like this. And this auth context is going to provide a property called provider. So we call here provider. And then this is going to return a store, or you can say the initial value. So here I'm going to call value is equal to, and then I'm going to pass this initial value here. So I'm going to copy this initial state and then specify that here. Just out of that, as you can see, we call here a property provider of this auth context. So we have to specify the same closing tag right here as well. So let me just copy this and specify that right here. Just out of that, right here, I'm going to call all my children. Right here, I'm going to call an object and say here children. Then I'm going to call the children and specify that right here. So if I add any component inside this auth provider, I can have all that components as a children of this auth provider. Now let me save the changes. Back to the index.js right here. And at the top, right up here, I'm going to say import. In the object, we need to call auth provider. As you can see, we have the export function auth provider. I'm going to call that here inside an object from specify here dot / hooks and then specify the auth file. And then I'm going to call this auth provider as a wrapper to this app component. So I'm going to call this auth provider something like this and specify the app component right inside this auth provider. So we can access the initial state, or you can say the central store in all my components. Let me save the changes. And now let me show you how you can access this value. So now to access this value in your component, you have to first back to the global.js. Right here, you can see we have the home page, and inside this home page, right up here, I'm going to call useContext hook of React. The useContext hook is used to access the value of the createContext. Inside this global.js, right up here, I'm going to say import. In the object, I'm going to say useContext, and I'm going to grab that from the React library like this. Inside this home component, I'm going to say constant auth is equal to useContext. And what you have to do is you have to specify the auth context, this one, to this useContext. So instead of importing this auth context from this auth file, I can create a function here. I can create my own hook so we can access the value of this auth context. So instead of this statement, let me get rid of it. Let me get rid of this import statement as well. And inside this auth.js, right down here, I can create my own auth consumer hook. So right down here, just out of this comment, I'm going to say export default. I'm going to specify the default export from this file and then specify here a function. The function name is auth consumer. Now that's about you. You can specify any name to this component. And then I'm going to return here use context. Now, as you know, I don't have this use context inside this file. Right here, let me just import that use context and specify that context right here, use context. And we need to pass here context. So I'm going to copy this auth context and specify that here. So now instead of using use context in the component, we can easily now use auth consumer. Let me just save the changes, copy this auth consumer, back to the global.js. Here, I'm going to say import auth consumer from dot / specify hooks, and we have here auth file. And now because this is the default export, we don't need to specify any parentheses. So just down here, I can simply specify constant auth is equal to auth consumer. That's it. And now if I see here console.log and print this auth, let me save the changes, open my console and reload it. You can see I'm going to have my auth value inside this console. And I can access the same value in any of this component using this auth consumer hook. So this is how you can create a context inside your React application. Let me just enhance this example and show you how you can change the value of this auth variable. Now, once you understand how you can add context inside this application to create authentication, let me show you how you can change the value of the context variable. Now, what if I try to change the value of this auth variable? Right now, if I save the changes, reload the browser, and open my console, I'm going to have here false from this auth. This is because the initial value of this auth is false. Now, what if I want to change this value? Let's suppose that if I specify here auth is equal to auth true. And if I change this constant to let, save the changes, then it's going to change that value. But if I try to access the same value in other component, let's suppose if I try to access the same value inside my login component, something like this, save these changes, you can see I'm going to have false again. This is because the store value is not actually changed. We change the variable value here, and this value is only accessible inside this component. What I want to change this store value. So what I can do is I can call here useReducer to change the value of the store. So let's see how to do it. Let me get rid of this and get rid of this statement. And here instead of let, we pass here constant. Save the changes, back to the auth, and at the top, right up here, you call useReducer. useReducer allows us to create a reducer function which can be used to change the value of the store. So just down here, let me just create a function. So I'm going to first say here export function reducer, and this reducer is going to have two parameters. First is state and second is action. Using action, you can specify value to this reducer function. Just for that, inside this reducer, we specify switch case. So we call here switch action.type, and inside this we call different cases. So we call here case. The first case is for login. So if the user call the login action type, then I'm going to execute this first case. And from this first case, I'm going to return auth, and the value is going to be true. So I'm just going to change the value of this initial variable when the action type is equal to login. Then I'm going to add another case, and this case is for logout. And if the action type is equal to logout, then I'm going to return auth false, the default initial state of this store. And then you also need to specify the default value for the switch case. So I'm going to say here default, and then I'm going to throw and new error. So I'm going to say here throw an error, something like this. Now just after that, once we have the reducer, we need to call this useReducer inside this auth provider. So what I'm going to do is right here inside this auth provider, I'm going to say useReducer, and this useReducer is going to take two arguments. First is a reducer function, and second is the initial value. As you know, we already have this reducer function, so we pass that reducer function as a first argument, and as a second argument, as you know, we have the initial value to the store, this variable. So we call here initial state as a second argument, something like this. And now this useReducer is going to return an array of properties, and from that array we're going to get two variables. So I'm going to say here constant. In the array, we are destructuring two variables from this useReducer. First is auth, and second is dispatch. First is the variable name, and second is the dispatch function used to change the value of the store. So right inside this auth, we have the initial state value, and using this dispatch function, we can change the value of this store. So now instead of this initial state, we can pass both these variables right here, something like this. And now I can call both these variables inside my component and change the value of the store. Let me just save the changes, back to the global.js, and here instead of just auth, I'm going to grab here an array of objects. So I'm going to add here an array and destructure two variables. First is auth, and second is dispatch. I'm going to copy this and specify that right here. So I'm going to dispatch two variables from this auth consumer. Now because auth consumer is going to return the use context, and the use context is going to be the initial state of this application. That is why from this value, we are going to get both these variables inside this component. Just out of that, right down here, I'm going to say console.log auth and save the changes. You can see I'm going to get the initial state value as a response. Paste that inside this login right here. Save the changes. I'm going to have the same result. Now, just out of that, once you understand how you can get the value from the store, let's suppose that you want to change that authentication value and you want to change this unauthorized user status to authorized. What you have to do is you have to just call this dispatch function with this login case. Let me show you how to do it. I'm going to back to the global.js right here. As you can see inside this login page right here, if I open the login, I'm going to have this division tag with the h1 heading tag. Instead of just this h1 heading tag, here I'm going to say this is the login page. And then I'm going to specify here a button And this button is going to allow us to call the dispatch function. Right now, I'm going to specify name to it, login. And then I'm going to specify some tailwind classes here. So class names is going to be first border, padding x5, bg indigo 500, then specify text gray 50 and rounded. So I'm going to call all these classes to this button. So I'm going to have this login button inside this login route. You can see just like that. When I click on this button, I want to call an on-click event. So right here, I'm going to say on-click. When I click on this button, I'm going to execute the handler function. Inside this handler function, I'm going to call this dispatch function, this one. So when I click on this button, I'm going to call this dispatch function. And what you have to do is you have to specify which case you want to execute when you call this dispatch function. So if you back to the auth.js, then you can notice here you have two cases. First is login and second is logout. What I want, when I click on this button, I want to execute this login case. So we call this login inside this parenthesis. So here we pass an object, specify here property type, and then specify this login case, this one. Something like this. Now because we specify action type, this property, that is why I call here a property called type and then specify value to it, login. So when this dispatch function call, it's going to execute this first case and change the value of this auth variable. And then it's going to return that value to the store and change the value of this initial state. Now let me save the changes and show you the result. Now when I click on this login button, you can see now the status is true. So now we have the authorized user inside this application. Now once you understand how you can authorize the user using this login button, let me show you how you can call the logout button. So let me copy this button right from this login and scroll down and open the dashboard right here. Here I'm going to call that button, and inside this dashboard, instead of this dashboard component, here I'm going to say this is the dashboard component, and then I'm going to change this login to logout. And instead of this type login, as you know, we have this logout type. Let me copy this and specify that here. So when you click on this logout button, it's going to change the initial state to false. Now just like that, what you have to do is you have to first call this dispatch inside this dashboard. As you know, we have this dispatch function from this auth consumer. So let me just copy this, specify that right here. But as you know, we are not using this auth variable inside this component. So instead of adding this auth, let me get rid of it and leave the comma as it is. Now when I back to the dashboard, I'm going to have this logout button. Now when I click on this logout button, it's going to change the status to false. Let me show you. If I click on this logout, you can see it's going to change the status to false. And we're going to have this status from this first homepage console.log. Now next, I want to add active links inside this application. So let's see how to do it. Now just out of that, what I want to make this navigation links active. So as you know, in the React router, we have a component called NavLink. And using that NavLink component, we can make these links active links. So let's see how to do it. What I'm going to do is instead of this link, I'm going to import a component called NavLink. And then inside this nav right here, as you know, we are using this link component. So instead of this link component, I'm going to specify this NavLink component, this one right here. But instead of just NavLink, what I want to change the color of this text as well when we click on this NavLink. So instead of just using this NavLink, let me create my own custom component to change the color of the text. So inside this nav right here, I'm going to create a function. That's upon you. You can create this function outside of this function or in the dedicated file. I'm going to create this function right inside this nav function. Here I'm going to say active link. I'm going to name this function active link and pass all the properties to it. So I'm going to pass here props. And then from this function, I'm going to return nav link. So I'm going to say here return nav link. And let me just self close this component. And just like that, from this nav link, I'm going to return a style. So I'm going to call here a style tag and then specify here a function. To make this nav link active, we specify here a function, a callback function. So we specify here a parenthesis, the arrow function like this, And inside this parenthesis, we call an object and call a property is active. And now we can access this is active right inside this style. Here I'm going to say return. In the object, we need to return color. I want to change the color of the text. So I'm going to specify here color. If the link is active, then I'm going to return here the hex value. So this is the hex value of the color. And if the link is not active, then return nothing. Just out of that, just out of this style, right down here, I'm going to specify here all my props. So I'm going to specify here an object, specify spread operator, and I'm going to specify all my props here. And now, instead of this NavLink, now we can use this active link. Let me copy this, change this NavLink to active link, and let me change this link component as well to active links. Something like this. Let me save the changes. I'm on the setting route. So this is going to change the color of the setting text. And I'm going to have this dark color to this link. If I back to the home, I'm going to have this color to this links. You can see. So now this active link component is going to show the active link inside this application. Now, just out of that, what I want, when the user click on this login button, I want to navigate user to the dashboard. So inside this login, right up here, inside this onClick event, I'm going to call the useNavigate hook. And we call this useNavigate hook from this React Router DOM. So right up here, I'm going to say useNavigate. We use this useNavigate hook to navigate the user to different location, or you can say to the different routes. So inside this login page, right down here, I'm going to say let navigate is equal to useNavigate. And using this navigate function, we can redirect the user to different routes. So inside this onClick, when the user click on the login button and successfully authorize, I'm going to redirect the user to the dashboard. So here I'm going to call navigate, and then inside this, you have to first specify the URL. So we pass here a single quote, and then I'm going to specify this URL, this one, dashboard. And just out of that, you specify here comma and specify options. So you just need to specify here an object and say replace true. So this is going to replace the current URL. Back to the login. When I click on the login button, you can see. And now what I want, when the user click on this dashboard, I want to navigate user to the login component. So to do that, let me copy this navigate, and right inside this dashboard right here, when the user click on this logout, I'm going to call navigate and redirect the user to this login component right here. And don't forget to call this navigate right up here. So we call here let navigate is equal to useNavigate. Save the changes. When I click on the login button, it's going to redirect us to the dashboard. And when I click on the logout button, it's going to redirect us to the login page. Now, let me do the same for this setting as well. So just out of this H1, here I'm going to add my logout button. And this is the setting page. And don't forget to call both these variables inside this setting. Let me save the changes. You can see I'm going to have the setting route as well inside this application. Now, once you understand how you can add a navigation menu, add active links to it, and add authentication inside your React application, let's take a look at how you can protect this dashboard and this setting route. As you can see, when I'm back to the login, right now I'm not the authorized user, but still I can access this dashboard and this setting page. What I want? I only wanted to access this dashboard and this setting page, or you can say the dashboard and the setting routes, only when the user is authorized. So let's take a look at how you can create protected routes inside this application. As you know, inside this auth, if you're back to the global.js, inside this auth variable, we have the authorized user status. So if you try to print this auth variable in the console, you will get the current status of the user. So let's suppose if I print this, if I say here console.log auth, open my console, and if I reload the browser, you can see the current authentication status is false. When I click on this login button, now the auth status changed to true. You can notice. Now we have the authorized user. And now I'm going to allow user to access this dashboard and this setting page. So what I'm going to do is, to make protected routes, I'm going to back to the global.js and write down here at the end, just out of this setting, I'm going to create here a function. So I'm going to say here export function, name this function require auth, or you can say require route. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this function. And inside this function, I'm going to get the auth variable. So I'm going to say here constant in the array. I'm going to get auth from auth consumer. And now I can use this variable to check the user status. Now, just out of that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a hook of React Router DOM, which is useLocation. So I'm going to call here comma and say useLocation. Now this useLocation hook is going to allow us to access this URL value. And we can also change this URL using this useLocation hook. So right down here inside this require auth, here I'm going to say constant location is equal to useLocation. We call that hook. So this hook is going to return the current location of the project. So right from this require auth, I'm going to say return if the auth.auth, if it is equal to true, then return the true statement. Otherwise, return the false statement. Inside this true statement right here, I'm just going to return all the children. So inside this parenthesis, let me just first call children and call the children right here. And inside this false statement, I'm going to navigate the user to the login page. I'm going to navigate the user to the login page. So here, I'm going to call the navigate component. As you know, we can also use this navigate hook to navigate the user to the login page. But this time, instead of this navigate hook, I'm going to call a component, which is navigate. Now that's upon you. Instead of using this navigate component, you can use this hook as well. But to show you how you can use navigate component, I'm going to grab and specify that component right inside this require auth. So inside this right here, I'm going to say navigate and call this component. And then I'm going to specify here to property. The to property is just like the href attribute, which allows the user to navigate to the different location. So I'm going to specify double quote, specify here login. So this is going to redirect the user to the login page. We need to call here a property called replace. I'm going to replace the current URL. So we call this property replace. And we're also going to change the state of the current location. So we call here state. And inside this, we call an object and pass path. And this path is going to be the location, this variable, dot path name. So we are going to pass the current path to this state and replace it. That's it. Just out of that, you copy this require auth and you call that inside your app.js right here. And just out of that, you have to make sure that you wrap your component inside this require auth to protect your route. So scroll down. As you know, I want to protect this dashboard and the settings. So right here, I'm going to say require auth, and inside that, I'm going to specify this dashboard, something like this. And don't forget to self close this component and do the same for this setting. So here I'm going to call this require auth, something like this. Grab this setting, specify that here, self close it, and get it out this closing setting. That's it. Let me save the changes. Now when I'm back to the dashboard, you can see I can't navigate to the dashboard. And I'm also can't navigate to the setting. This is because currently I'm not the authorized user. But if I click on this login, you can see I can now access this dashboard and this setting. But now what I want, if the user is not authorized, I don't want to show both these tabs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll up back to this nav component, and right here, just out of this login, you can just simply call here an object, and right here, you're going to call the auth consumer and call the authentication status. So right up here, you're simply going to call constant in the array, you call auth from auth consumer, and when you have this auth, you can then specify that right here. But let me just show you how you can grab the property of this auth right here inside this parenthesis. As you know, to this auth, you have a property called auth. So to get this auth property from this auth, you have to just specify here an object and just specify the auth property. That's it. So now you can access this auth from this auth consumer. Now once I have this auth, let me specify that here. And then here I'm going to say if the auth is true, then return the true statement. Otherwise return nothing. So I'm going to self close the statement. And then inside this here, I'm going to say dashboard, and the setting. Something like this. Save the changes. You can see I'm just going to have home and login. But when I click on the login button, now I can have login, dashboard, and setting. Now because I'm the authorized user, I can access the dashboard and the setting. But if I try to click on this logout button, it's going to remove both these tabs from this navigation menu. And I'm just going to have the login page. And now I'm not the authorized user. So I can't access the dashboard and the setting page. So I hope you understand how you can protect your routes using React Router. Now let me show you a pro tip for all the beginners who are using routes in the React application. Now whenever you use route in the large React application, you don't have to use routes inside the React component. Instead, you create an object inside a dedicated file and use that object inside your React component. So you can easily manipulate and change your route components. Let me show you what I want to say. Here, inside my project, inside the source directory, I'm going to create a new folder, name this folder routes, and inside this routes, I'm going to create a file called route.js. Inside this file, I'm going to create an object. So I'm just going to simply first say export default, and then I'm going to export an array of objects. I'm going to call here an array, and I'm going to grab the object from this app.js file. So I'm going to grab this object right from here, and then specify that object inside this route.js file right here, something like this. Just out of that, once I have that object, don't forget to import these components. So just back to the app.js, grab this import statement, and then specify that right up here. Don't forget to change this path. Just out of that, you have to call this object inside your app component. So at the top here, you say import route, and you get this route from this route file. So you specify here route, and then you get rid of the statement and return route. But this is just going to return this object. But what I want to wrap this route inside the use routes. So I'm going to say here use route, and then specify this route here. And then I'm going to return this use route from this app component. You can see I'm going to have the same result. It will not change anything. But what I can do is now I can use this object and iterate over this navigation menu. And instead of these hard-coded links, I can grab these links from this object and print my navigation menu here. Let me show you what I want to say. Let me get rid of this statement. Let me comment this and comment both these statements. And at the top right here, what I want to iterate over this object. So I'm going to back to the global. I'm going to first print this active link. I want this home page in all my pages. So I'm going to grab this active link of home page and then specify that right here. And just after that, right down here, I'm going to specify an object. And inside this, I'm going to iterate over this object. So to get this object right up here, I'm going to specify import route from the route file. So I'm going to import the route object. Now because the route object is the default export from this file, I can access this with different variable names. So once I have this object, I can then specify that right here and then iterate over it. But if you try to print this, let me get rid of this. And if I say here console.log, and if I print this route, save this file, open the console, reload the browser, then you can see here I'm going to have an array. And inside that array, I'm going to have here path, element, and all my children's. You can notice. And inside the children's, I'm going to have all my routes. So what I want to get the children first from this route and then iterate over this object. I don't need to iterate over this parent object. Instead, I need to iterate over this child object. So right from this route, I'm going to get the child object. So to get that, as you can see, you already have this syntax. So right down here, I'm going to say let in the array inside an object, I'm going to say children, and I'm going to get the children from route. As you know, inside this route, I have the children property. So I'm going to specify that children property here, and I'm going to iterate over the children property. So let me grab this. And if I console.log this, Then I'm going to have the children property. You can see I'm going to have this array, and inside that array, I'm going to have all my children's. Let me get rid of this console, and let me get rid of this console message as well, right from this login page. Just out of that, right down here. Once I have the children, I can specify that here and iterate over it. So I'm going to say here dot. I can iterate over this object using map function, and then I'm going to specify here two values. First is the value, and second is the index. Inside this value, I'm going to have all the objects, and inside this I, we have the index value. I use this I to specify the unique key to my children. So just down here, I'm first going to say console.log and print value. If I print this value, it's going to print all my objects. You can notice. Now what I want to this path, I want to specify the route name. If you're back to the route, I don't have here a route name. So I need to specify here route name, so I can specify that route name to the link. So right here, just out of this login, here, I'm going to specify a property called route name. Now that's about you can specify any name to this property. And then I'm going to specify name to it, login. Now this is just a display name for this login route. You can specify any name here. We are just using this name to display as a link inside this navigation menu. Just out of that, let me copy this, specify that to the dashboard, and this is for dashboard. So I'm going to say here dashboard. Let me copy this, specify that right here, and then specify the settings here. Now, as you know, I don't need to specify any route name to this index because this is the default route for this path. And we already have the home path link imported inside this global file. You can notice. So I don't need to iterate over this home path. So I'm just going to iterate over this object, and I also need to specify the protected routes. So I'm going to specify here a comma and say here protected. That's upon you. You can specify any name to this protected property. And now login is not the protected route. So we pass here protected false. Let me do the same for this dashboard, but this time the protected is true because dashboard is the protected route. Let me copy this, specify that here. Something like this. Save this file back to the global.js, and here I can access these values. So what I can do is here I'm going to pass dot and then specify route name. This is going to print all the route name, you can see, and now it's also going to print the undefined value. The reason behind this is for this index route we don't have this route name property. That is why I'm going to get this undefined message. Just out of that, I can easily access the protected route as well. So if I specify here protected, reload the browser, you can see I'm going to have the protected route as well. And this is also print the undefined value. The reason behind this is we have the index route here. Now, just out of that, right down here, I can say if the value dot route name, if we have true inside this route, then execute it. And I'm also going to check value dot protected. If this value dot protected is equal to true, then execute the if block, otherwise execute the else block. So right here, I'm going to say if the protected is equal to auth, this variable, then return the if block. So I'm going to specify here a question mark, and then I'm going to specify this link here. So let me copy this, specify that link here, specify colon, and specify false value. So just I'm going to specify here false. I'm not going to return anything from this else statement. And instead of this hard-coded home right here, I can specify this value route name, something like this. And to this hard-coded path, I can simply specify value dot path. As you know, we have this path property to all these objects. I can specify that here. And we also need to specify the unique key. So we pass here key and pass the index value, this one. And just out of that, we need to return this statement. So instead of these curly braces, I can specify here parentheses. So this will just automatically return this statement. Let me save this. You can see I'm going to have my login page and home page. Now when I click on this login button, it's going to open the dashboard and the setting page. Now I'm the authorized user. So now I can access the dashboard and setting. Now this is going to hide the login page because right now I'm the authorized user. I don't have to log in again. So this will hide the login page. If I click on this logout button again, you can see I'm going to have my home page and the login page. Now, if you want to make this login as a default route, then you can copy this active link and then specify the login route here. That's upon you. So you can make this login route default for all the pages. If you have any question, don't forget to comment me down. Like this video if you find anything useful. Subscribe for more latest videos. That is all for now. I will see you in the next one.